A lot of the time, when I find a vintage image of a dress or another garment that I really want to recreate, I never really find out the story behind the piece, maybe at most who wore it. But in this case, as I worked more and more on this project, I uncovered a really interesting story that combined my love of fashion and of music and music history together. So this is a dress worn by Pattie Boyd, who was a model in the 60s and is probably most famous for being married to George Harrison in the 60s and like the first half of the 70s, and Eric Clapton in the second half of the 70s and in the 80s. She inspired a lot of really famous songs that you might know, like Something by the Beatles, which was written by Harrison, and Layla and Wonderful Tonight by Eric Clapton. And aside from being married to really famous musicians, she was famous in her own right in her modeling career, though being married to a Beatle did help her career quite a bit. I first stumbled across this dress when I was researching pictures to possibly recreate as part of a class assignment. I had to do a presentation on I chose 60s music and make something from the 1960s, and so I figured the easiest way for me to do that would be to sew something. At first, I thought about making something that wasn't at all related to the counterculture or anything like that, just like something that you would find on a 60s sewing pattern. But I'm gonna be honest, 60s fashion is one of my least favorite decades, and so I wasn't able to find anything that really excited me, and also I had the materials to make. So instead I turned to more hippie fashion. I figured that might be a little bit more interesting, especially given my interest in 60s music, but I found again and again that the cool things that I possibly wanted to make were very dependent on these really interesting psychedelic fabrics, and I didn't want to have to buy anything new for this project, so I kept searching for something that felt like it was from the 60s but could be made with other fabrics, and I eventually found this dress. At first I was only able to find like 2 or 3 angles of the dress, and I thought I could find coordinating fabrics that didn't quite match this dress, but would coordinate nicely in this design. So yeah, that's kind of the place where I was at when I started pattern drafting. Leading up to this, I knew a fair amount about George Harrison and Pattie Boyd and their whole story together, but I was not at all familiar with this specific dress. So first I started with the pattern drafting. This dress is relatively simple in its patterning, so I figured it would be a great opportunity to try using my new dress form to draft a pattern. I actually made a video about how I made this dress form, you could check it out if you feel like it, but I was mainly looking to see how much did this custom dress form actually fit my measurements. Just to be clear, I have no idea how to actually drape or draft patterns directly on the dress form. I've only ever done it flat, and I didn't even watch any videos on it. I kind of just went for it just to see what would happen. So as you can see here, I'm pinching out 2 darts, one at the armhole that kind of goes to the bust, and one at the waist that also goes to the bust, and then I'll connect those to create a princess seam on the front of the dress. On my reference images, it's more clear in the color version, which at this point I knew was displayed in a museum in like the 2010s somewhere in Europe, and on that dress you can see the stripes just barely don't line up, and that's where the princess seam is. And using a marker, I traced all of the seam lines that I wanted, using the dress form to trace things like the shoulder and the arm's eye and the side seam, and using the folds that I created to trace where the princess seam was going to go. Then I unpinned that from my dress form and could cut it out. I know I just showed the drafting for the front of the bodice, but the back of the bodice was really simple. I just kept it really basic and just put shoulder and waist darts in it. The skirt looked to be a half circle skirt, and the sleeve I got off one of my vintage sewing patterns. I don't exactly remember off the top of my head which pattern it is, but I'll put it on the screen. Because I wasn't directly copying the fabrics from this dress, I was able to get a little bit creative as to which fabrics I used. So for the bodice, I decided to use this kind of quilting cotton sort of cotton, and this is actually from Colonial Williamsburg, and so it's a reproduction of an 18th century print. For the sleeves and the skirt, I wanted something flowy so that the dress would move like it moves in the pictures with Pattie Boyd. So I decided to use this silk chiffon. If you've been watching my videos for a long time, you might remember that I made a 1950s evening dress partially out of this back in 2022, was it? And you might see it in the footage, but this stuff has been sitting wrinkled in my closet for 2 years at this point, and so I wasn't quite able to press out all of the wrinkles. However, because silk chiffon is a sheer fabric, I needed some sort of underskirt in the dress. Ideally, I probably would have liked to use the floral 18th century print, but I wasn't sure if I was going to have enough, and the fabric's kind of stiff, so it wouldn't move like I wanted it to, so that was kind of off the table. However, I've had this printed cotton voile for like 3 years, I think. Originally, I wanted to make it into a 1940s shirt dress, but that didn't end up happening, and so I figured I wasn't going to use it for anything else, so I might as well use it for this project. And voile is a lot thinner than quilting cotton, so it was going to be able to move like I wanted it to. Sorry that the footage for cutting out the skirt was so bad. I took like 3 clips, but I didn't realize that my camera was zoomed in them, and so you can't really see anything in any of them. Just trust me though, it's a half circle skirt. The first thing I did was just sewing the darts on the back of the bodice, the shoulder darts and the waist darts. Even just from this back piece, I can tell that this dress form fits my body so much better than the self-drafted block patterns that I was using previously. It just like matches the curves of my shoulders so much better. While I was at the machine, I also sewed the princess seams on the front of the bodice and the shoulder seams as well. I'm keeping the side seams open because I want to set my sleeve flat because it's just a lot faster and easier than setting it into the arm size, so in preparation for that, I'm not sewing my side seams. Also, I forgot to mention, because I didn't really know the story of this dress, I kind of just wanted to get this project done quickly, and so you'll see me breaking a lot of sewing rules while making this. It was just something that I was making for a class, and the class is on pop culture, not sewing, so like, I figured no one would know if I did it badly. I do kind of regret not taking my time with this dress now that I have a bit more history on it, because I feel like I could have done so much better, but also I'm still really happy with the result, so I don't mind that much. Also, to expedite things a bit more, I'm sewing the gathering threads along the sleeve cap in preparation for setting them, and I'm sewing those by machine. At this point, the main pieces of my bodice were assembled, except for the side seams as I mentioned before, and so I could begin to set my sleeve, using the gathering threads that I just put in to create the puffed sleeve as seen in the picture. Instead of just concentrating the gathering at the very top of the sleeve cap, as you'd kind of expect in a puffed sleeve, this sleeve has kind of an even distribution of gathering at every place except for the very bottom, and so I made sure to do that when I was setting the sleeve. Then I just sewed it to the bodice. I don't know if there's some sort of sewing reason why you're not supposed to set all of your sleeves flat, but I read about it in a 1940s sewing guide, and they advised to do it just for basic sleeves in like work clothing, but I have to say, I'm really enjoying it even in projects like this that are a bit more than just casual. It just makes the process so much easier and so much faster than trying to set the sleeve while it's in its final curved shape. And to prevent the seam allowance from showing through the translucent fabric, I did a line of top stitching all around the armhole to keep it stitched to the bodice piece and not to the sleeve. And then I stitched the side seams, starting at the waist and just going all the way up to the armhole and down the sleeve. I stitched both sides in this manner because I was planning on doing a back zipper, not a side zipper. At this point, I could start working on the skirt, and so to prevent it from shifting around, I just basted the over layer of chiffon to the base skirt, which was again that printed cotton voile. And then I could just sew the waist seam, sewing the skirt to the bodice. However, at this point, I tried on the dress and the waistline was just way too low. I thought I raised it in the pattern drafting, but turns out I didn't raise it quite enough because it hit basically directly at my natural waist, and this dress has a bit of a raised waistline. With the lower waist, it kind of looked more 70s than 60s, and so I just cut the bodice an inch or two above the waistline and re-sewed the skirt to that new waist. I also faced the dress at this point. The neckline was a bit tight, and that's why you can see my stitching line is so far from the actual edge of the fabric. Just kind of demonstrating how little I cared about this project, as I'm understitching the facing to keep it from rolling out of the dress, you can see that part of the facing I accidentally sewed the wrong way around and I didn't even bother fixing it. There you can see the white wrong side of the fabric. Like I mentioned, I stitched inwards from the edge of the fabric to make the neckline wider, and so I just cut that extra bit away before clipping all of the curves so that the facing would turn smoothly to the inside of the dress. At this point, the dress was nearly finished, and so I could do the back closure. I accidentally cut the back of the bodice on the fold instead of leaving a seam there for me to put the zipper in, and so I just cut that open and hoped it wouldn't be too tight. And this zipper was a tad bit short, and so in the end there are a few hooks and eyes on the very top of the dress to keep it closed. Yeah, I just stitched that to the back of the dress. You can see I didn't even bother to change the foot of my machine to a zipper foot when stitching it on. I also sewed the back seam of the skirt because I hadn't closed that yet, but I did end up unpicking this and sewing the outer layer seam and the lining seam separately in order to make hemming the dress easier. So what you're seeing right now where I sew both seams together, I ended up getting rid of that. The neck facing wasn't staying on the inside of the dress, so I figured no one would ever know if I just maybe put a line of stitching around the top edge to keep it in place. And here you can see that gap between where the top of the dress is and where the zipper actually starts. I did end up hand sewing a few hooks and eyes there to keep the top of the dress closed. One of the final things I had to do on the base dress was creating the cuffs of the sleeves. This is one of the few parts of the project that I actually wanted to turn out well, so I kind of tried on these, though I did make a few shortcuts. So I cut out these rectangles of fabric that were the same length as my wrist with a little bit of room for overlap, then I sewed them into 2 rectangles. Then I could add gathering threads to the bottom of the sleeve so that they would gather up tightly at the cuffs, and I unpicked the sleeve seam a little bit so that my hand would be able to fit into the cuffed sleeve. Here you can see I just unpicked maybe 3 inches or so. And then I just gathered the thread that I put in, I took the rectangle of fabric, turned it right side out, and pinned that to the gathered sleeve. As I said, I did take a few shortcuts though. Instead of adding facings to nicely finish the slit in the sleeve that I'd unpicked earlier, I instead, when I was top stitching the cuff into place, I just stitched down the seam allowance so that the raw edges wouldn't show. It actually doesn't look as bad as I thought, like it looks pretty clean, so I might be doing that again in the future. Then I used my buttonhole foot to add a buttonhole at the sleeve. And then I just hemmed the dress. It was around this point where I started to look a bit deeper into this dress in preparation for making this video, and I suddenly found a wealth of information and photos that weren't online before, and soon enough I was able to find that Pattie Boyd had actually sold this dress at auction, literally while I was making this project. I couldn't believe it. A lot of the music artists that I've been listening to have been doing, their farewell tours, they've been selling their catalogs, and similarly to them, Pattie Boyd's been selling her personal collection of items. She's auctioned off some really cool things, like pictures that she took of the Beatles and with George Harrison, and letters between her and Clapton and Harrison, and it's really, really fascinating. Not sure how many of you are actually interested in the music though, so to keep it fashion-based, this dress was one of the dresses that she was selling. She was selling a few, and most of them were completely unique and made directly for her, so the auction website was able to provide a bit more information on the dress. So I'll put the auction link in the description in case you want to read the information for yourself, but basically this dress was made by a Dutch artist collective called The Fool, and they did a lot of work for the Beatles. They painted some instruments for them, and they painted a mural in George and Pattie's house, and they also painted the facade of Apple Boutique, which was a short-lived Beatles clothing store in the late 60s, which I found out about because of this dress, which was pretty interesting. So this dress was made especially for Pattie Boyd, but another version was also made for her sister Jenny Boyd, and she wore it in a music video for the 60s artist Donovan, who made this 15-minute music video for, I think it's 3 or 4 of his songs. It's a really psychedelic video and frankly kind of strange, but you're able to see how this dress moved when Jenny Boyd is wearing it in the video. I'll see if I can insert a clip here. I'll just read you this quote from the auction house that's directly related to the dress. It says, "A psychedelic cotton mini dress designed by The Fool, 1967, unlabeled, the acid green and pink striped bodice with peasant sleeves of floral cotton garbardine and braided trim. The skirt with swirling foliate motif and scalloped hem, worn by Pattie Boyd for a flight from London Heathrow to Los Angeles with George Harrison, Neil Aspinall, and Magic Alex Madras on the 1st of August, 1967. So this kind of confirmed a few things that I heard in a TikTok about this dress. Up to this point, this TikTok was the only information that I had about the dress, and some of it contradicts what the auction house is saying, and so since that information probably came from Pattie herself, I trust that over the TikTok. But basically, to my understanding, George and Pattie went on a trip to California in 1967, and she wore this dress while getting off the airplane, and that's why there are so many press photos related to it. I looked again for photos, and I was able to find a few more, even color photos from the 60s, so we could actually see how the dress looked instead of just using the color photos from today. So yeah, I just think it was so cool how I found out that this dress was being sold while I was making it, and I was able to get so much more information on it. I think I got really sidetracked while talking about that. So basically, you've been watching me make the little bolero for this dress. I made it out of some green cotton corduroy, again drafting the pattern on my dress form. cutting it out with a tiny bit more seam allowance so that it would have some ease, and to replicate the embroidery in the jacket that she wore in California in 1967, I didn't want to spend the time to hand embroider the whole thing, and so I decided to play around with some machine embroidery. I've never done anything like this before, and so it's really messy, but I just tried to put some geometric shapes and put some flower motifs and stuff. I think because it's the 60s and kind of bohemian and hippie style, I think it kind of works. Obviously, I would have rather taken the time to do the hand embroidery, but that would have taken so long, so I don't really regret the machine embroidery. I decided the easiest way to make this jacket was to make a lining out of the same material and just turn it inside out like a bag. So yeah, I just made the jacket twice and stitched them together and turned it inside out through the armholes. Of course, clipping my corners and everything. And then to finish off the armholes, I just tucked the raw edges to the inside and top stitched around to close the opening. I never actually did all of the hand sewing finishing work on the dress, so that was the last thing for me to do. Since this chiffon stretched so much with gravity, I just evened up the hem, not being super careful about it because the original did have a scalloped hem, so it was okay if mine was a bit messy, and I kind of rolled the chiffon in between my fingers to create a very narrow hem. That entire hem was finished by hand. I did this on a floor-length circle skirt for my 1950s evening dress, so this mini skirt felt really quick to do, but it did take a few hours to get done. For the cuffs, I chose 2 tortoiseshell buttons that kind of matched the rest of the dress and sewed those onto the cuffs. The very last thing I had to do was the waistbands and the matching belt for the dress. Originally, I wanted to crochet these and maybe do some color work within the crochet, but I wanted to do it at a really fine gauge using my cotton crochet thread. But I realized that would take such a long time, and the color work at that small of a scale and the amount that I wanted to do would have been so annoying, and I would have regretted my decision immediately, so instead I went back to machine embroidery. This is a strip of silk cut from some fabric that my friend gave me as a gift. It's not really enough to make anything, so I figured this small amount of silk would do well on this dress. I just sewed it into a tube and then used the safety pin trick to turn it inside out, and then I used my machine to make a little bit of a design on it. First, I used white and then the straight stitch to just put a row of stitching on each end, and then I used the same flower motif that I used on the bolero just down the middle of this ribbon. For the amount of effort that I put into it, I think it looks surprisingly good. Like, crochet would have been better, but I feel like this is a fine compromise. Then I just stitched it to the dress, anchoring it at the front, back, side seams, and at the center front, just using a few invisible hand stitches to keep that in place. For the armbands, I made sure that all of the raw edges were hidden, and then I hand stitched those into place. So here's how the dress came out. Although the fabrics are different from the original, I feel like it has the same feel to it, and I feel like the pattern and shape of the dress is still really true to the original. As for the fit of the dress, I was expecting it to be like most of my garments and have a few fit issues, not be the most comfortable, but it actually fits my body really well. Like, if I made it again, I would have added a bit more ease in a few places, but overall, I'm really happy with it for the amount of effort that I put in, not doing any mock-ups or anything, so I'll definitely be using this dress form for patterning in the future. The back of the dress is kind of plain because I didn't put any embroidery on the back of the bolero. I feel like that's not accurate to the 60s because they certainly would have continued the bright, bold design details onto the back of the bolero. Also, I feel like the basic back just doesn't match the cool design elements that it has underneath the arm where there's that large cutout. You can see my unfinished edges on the slit in the cuff, but surprisingly, it looks okay from the outside, so I don't really hate it, it's just not going to last very long. And here you can see the actual sorts of geometric designs that I put on the bolero. I kind of tried to mimic the big circular patterns that looked a little bit like eyes on the original. I'm super happy with this project. I'd definitely like to do 60s again sometime in the future, and this summer I'm also planning on going further back in time and doing a Victorian project if you're interested in that too. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.